All right, welcome to the RSP cast. Special guest, JJ Zacahariason. This is going to be great. JJ, I'm big fan of what you do. We had so much fun last year getting a chance to trade podcasts and get a chance to talk, and I had a good time once again this year when you invited me on. And it's not like I'm returning the favor. I mean, shit, I'd have you on whether you had me on or not. I just like having, it's fun to have your perspective, and especially with the late round draft guide. We're going to talk a lot about that today and talk about some, broader thinking questions in terms of redraft and philosophy and how we look at the league and stuff like that. So welcome.
Thanks for having me, man. It's always a pleasure. I like having these sort of like homeaways with you. Every year now you get to come to. It's like a Pittsburgh Cleveland, a Steelers Browns divisional, thing going on here where we play one at my house and then one at your house, later in the season. It's a lot of fun.
That's good, and considering that I'm a split personality when I just bought two Ravens hats, it still fits.
So. Well, it's funny. My wife has family that we're close with that are Ravens fans. They're from that area and they live in that area. And when the Steelers lost the Ravens, the playoffs this past year, which was everyone knew was going to happen, they sent both of my kids Lamar Jackson jerseys. So now, and the funny thing is that my son at his daycare had a purple day where they had to wear purple, and it was the only purple he had. So if my 17-year-old self knew that I was sending my son to daycare in a Ravens jersey, I would have punched myself in the face. But that's where we're at these days. You would agree. I mean, as we do this and we learn about the game, we just appreciate like good organizations and good talent and all of that. And I mean, I love Lamar Jackson, and I thought that I would never, back in the day when I was growing up in Pittsburgh, I thought I would never say something like that.
Yeah, as a Browns fan, I would have been like, I want to see Turkey Jones do his thing all day against every Steelers player that I can absolutely find. And what I saw Myles Garrett do, as despicable as it was really on the outside, there was part of me on the inside that was like, good, but at the same time, when the Cleveland Browns, the real Browns, left the city and the Steelers fans were the way they were, that tells you it's like family. It's like cousins who have a rivalry. And every player I've talked to who's played with the Steelers, no matter how long or how short, was like it's a class organization up and down. The way it's run is the envy of the league in terms of a lot of the ways that they do things on a day-to-day basis. And, there's a lot of respect for that organization. And it's fun. That's what I love about the AFC North, because, other than Cincinnati, we all, which everybody likes to make fun of, but even then you got to have some respect for that offense. But even so, it's kind of one of those things where it's like, we're gonna beat up on each other, but you want to see your teams from your division beat up on everybody else. There's that feel about that.
It's a family thing. You punch your brother, but then whenever your brother's fighting someone else at school, you'd back him up.
Yeah, exactly. And that's always been. It's always felt that way, unlike any other division that I've seen. Maybe I'm just But anyway, so let's start with this. I love the late round draft guide, and if you guys haven't got it, you got to go check out, JJ's site. You got to, download it. It is well written, has excellent analysis. You're going to get really great perspective from someone who really looks at the data well, and also has the perspective of a fantasy player who's been doing this for a while and and just shares information in a really entertaining, just in a way where you feel like you're just talking with somebody. And you've got a great voice with this. And there are a lot of people who share data that just don't have the writing voice to do it all the time, and you really do. So
thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So what have you learned, maybe from a broader perspective over the years, about playing fantasy football from your work doing the late round draft guide?
Yeah, look, it's a great question. It's one that I'm sure we could go in and talk about for hours, just because when you're digging into this stuff, and you're digging deep into this stuff, and you're doing it for years, year over year over year, I think the number one thing is that you become very humbled by results. I talk a lot about variance in that guide every year because, and embracing variance, which I think is a key descriptor with variance. Results are going to happen in this game that seem to defy all logic. You and I talked about that with prospecting where, you might really like a prospect, but there's going to be situations where you can still really like that prospect, but other external factors that were completely unpredictable and really, really difficult to project end up happening and end up hitting. And that's just something that, from our perspective, as I always say, sitting in our parents' basement, analyzing this stuff, it's really hard to, foresee some of that stuff happening. NFL teams don't even foresee some of that stuff happening. So I think that it's really important, to recognize that sometimes you're going to be on the right side of variance. Sometimes you're going to be on the wrong side. And to me, I would say that the number one takeaway when it comes to variance is that fantasy football is not so much about precision as it is just about being directionally right. And so, I think that's where there's this sort of like I actually hate some of the analytics work that some folks put out there because it's very concrete. It's very black and white. It's very, this is the way that it's going to be. Whereas I don't see it that way at all. I think that we're looking at data to get in the right direction, not to say this is the right answer. Great example of that. You can let's just look at some prospects that people have either been in on or not on. But, you and I both really liked Isaiah Pacheco when he came out, right? And so we're saying, yeah, draft Isaiah Pacheco in your rookie drafts, et cetera, et cetera. Neither of us are saying draft Isaiah Pacheco in the first round of your rookie draft, right? We're simply saying there are some things here that point in a direction that could be really favorable. And then you layer on scheme and you layer on what they might be looking for in Kansas City. And then all of a sudden you build this narrative and say, yeah, throw that dart at Isaiah Pacheco. I would rather throw that dart at him than some other running back that you would get in a similar range. Another good example is Puka Nacua. I liked Puka Nacua coming out. I didn't sit and scream from the rooftops that Puka Nacua was going to be one of the best wide receivers in the game, 3 years into his career and have the best or arguably the best rookie season that we've ever seen from a wide receiver, And so there's a big difference between being precise and being directionally correct.
Yeah. And like you with him too, like I had the same thing. It was like I said, he's the most underrated player on my board based on sweet spot of where you go, but he was still like in the top of my third tier. He wasn't in my first two tiers.
And I think that it does an audience a disservice when you're sitting there. Look, you should be able to get excited when things go your way because we're human and this is why we do this. When Isaiah Pacheco, when Pacheco was drafted, I sent a semi-sarcastic tweet that said, and you can still find it, but it said, Isaiah Pacheco's coming for Clyde Edwards-Helaire's job, right? Which at the time was bonkers to say. It's a seventh round pick, and Clyde Edwards-Helaire had the draft capital backing him, what have you. But, to me, it's more so, of course, whenever Isaiah Pacheco does well, I'm going to be excited when Pacheco does well. Or, Puka Nacua does well, of course I'm going to be excited when he does well. But I think it needs to be stated just from an analyst speaking to an audience perspective that it's not, you should not go out there and saying, I got this completely right, because you did not get this completely right. You were just directionally right. And you were looking at this from a range of outcomes perspective. And, fantasy football is just liking a player a little bit more than the consensus does, and that at the end of the day, that's when you're going to be in on a player or not in on a player, is if you like that player a little bit more than where others are ranking him. Right. And when those hit, that's great. When they don't, that's unfortunate, but hopefully your process that you've sort of developed and put together is going to give you more of those directionally right hits more than not. So my overall approach to fantasy is embracing variance and knowing that I just need to be directionally correct, and thinking about range of outcomes, directionally correct, as opposed to just being so super precise with everything, because that's just an impossible thing to achieve.
Yeah, that's very true, and it's a great point. I mean, on the opposite end of the spectrum, in terms of like players that you like that maybe you're directionally correct. Sometimes you can have players you don't like, but you can see the fit is a good direction for them. I think a good example this year could be a guy like Ollie Gordon down the line. Like I'm not a huge Ollie Gordon fan as a guy who scouts the game, but when I look at what he does well, he's good at what Miami may ask him to do. So if he gets an opportunity to be able to play in that role, he could be successful in the way that Elijah Mitchell was successful. Right. And then, those are guys that directionally, I may not like them from their skill set relative to everybody else, but I go, okay, that's a good fit, and you should ride it for as long as it lasts. And then you can give advice about, well, this might be a sell high player, but it's still worth maybe getting in on that player and riding it for a little bit to get some value from it.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. So, are there any conclusions in your guide this year or even in recent years, where you feel they're maybe counterintuitive to you for whatever reason, but based on the past work you've done, you've just learned to trust what feels counterintuitive because of because of the experience you've had doing the work and the knowledge?
Yeah, I think that I don't know if it's like totally counterintuitive, but I do think that it plays into sort of the risk tolerance that folks kind of approach like a draft with. But like one example I always use. So I've always, at least in recent years, I've sort of broken down each position by grouping within positional ranks. So I'll look at like RB1s and what we typically get from them from an ADP perspective, and then into RB2s, and then sort of like the middle rounds, which is usually where you get into like RB3s, RB4s, and so on. And when you look at the middle round running backs, usually, not usually, there's a trend that, usually you would think that a previous season points per game average would be predictive. And we know that it is predictive of future points per game. So, if you want to look at, people will look at like these really detailed stats and they'll get clicks based on what they're throwing on Twitter and stuff like that. But like more than half the time, those stats are not predictive whatsoever. It's just fun things to look at, which is fine, right? But I think that a lot of people will, take certain data points and think that they are predictive and run with them and say, I'm going to make this decision in my draft based on this data point, when that data point isn't even like just doesn't matter, right? But one thing that is kind of interesting is that, well, number one, we know that points per game in one season is going to be predictive of points per game in a future season, which is not that surprising because good players are generally good and they're going to be scoring, more fantasy points. But what I found in the middle rounds, so we're talking like RB3s, RB4s, is that previous season points per game at running back is actually not predictive whatsoever. And oftentimes the opposite is what's more predictive. So if you get a middle round running back who did nothing the previous season or is a rookie or what have you, those players are often more beneficial for your fantasy team than if you get a middle round running back who was, let's say, an RB2, the previous season. And you might ask, well, what? So anytime that kind of thing pops up, I ask why, because I want to at least find some sort of narrative that I can speak to and talk about, and that, at least makes intuitive sense to me that I can sort of test and think about more scientifically. But the main reason for that is, number one, younger players are actually really, really good bets in fantasy football and redraft leagues. Like, I mean, it's been that way for decades at this point because people just hate ambiguity. They hate the unknown. They hate all of that. So if you get, let's say, a really strong day 2 running back in the middle of the 7th round or in the 8th round or something like that, and maybe their situation isn't super clear because they're sharing a backfield, or they are a rookie, so you're just really concerned about that transition from college to the pros. Well, generally speaking, if they're a day 2 running back, especially like a second round one that you liked a lot as a prospect after you were doing your scouting, those players will emerge because they're talented. Like they're just good players, right? And we know that running back, it takes a little bit less time, to translate and start working in the NFL. Whereas you have to ask yourself, if there's an RB2 from a previous season that's now in RB3, RB4 range, ask yourself why. Well, there's probably a reason for it. Maybe it's the age cliff and people are concerned about that. Maybe it's the fact that that backfield got more competition. Maybe there was a scheme change, or maybe the previous season, it was just fluky, and the market is generally recognizing that flukiness from that previous season. So the thing, overall, I've really, really leaned into embracing ambiguity throughout my drafts, and sort of like, you speaking to doing the opposite and such all the time, and like going against the grain of what the market is kind of telling you. This kind of lands in that same ballpark where it's this idea that the market is going to do things that are very risk averse, when you actually want to embrace that risk and have a little bit more of that tolerance, because those are the players that generally do become league winners. So if you're staring at these like really boring running backs in the 7th, 8th round, they're actually generally boring running backs that you should usually just avoid. Go after the 1st and 2nd year guys who actually have that kind of ceiling.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, and it's funny because it's like I remember who said it, and it was someone way smarter than us, but basically basically said that when everything looks safe, that's when you should probably embrace the risk, because that's when it's the most dangerous.
Yeah.
Is when something that was like outside the box is now suddenly embraced as well inside the epicenter of the box. That's when it becomes very risky to do that. So, all right, what about this year? Like with draft strategies this year, what you're seeing, what you're working on right now, are there any approaches this year that you're interested in exploring a little bit more? And then maybe before you do that, maybe outline for us maybe what are some approaches and philosophies with draft strategy that you take. I mean, you just talked about one of them right there, which is just like as a point in the strategy is like, you know, running backs and how we view them and what we're looking at in the middle rounds and from a safety perspective. But what else along those lines?
Yeah, you know, I'm in the midst of putting it all together for this year, so this is a really like on the point question for me, because I'm in the middle of sort of like researching this.
Me too.
And more so like ideating, right? Like,
yeah.
Like the hardest part to fantasy football content, in my opinion, is the ideation side, and it's the part that people usually don't want to do, and so they just kind of resort back to doing more of the players to target player. And there's places for that. Don't get me wrong. Like I do that too.
Sure.
But the hardest part is like really asking these questions of like what is happening and being more philosophical with this stuff. Right. Yeah. And I know it's incredibly nerdy to say that, but it's the truth in terms of just like trying to really take the strategy game and be one step ahead of the market with all of this stuff. So one thing that I'm really watching this year, and one thing that I'm going to be researching even more, and I did a podcast, an episode on this earlier in the offseason. This past year, the running back position, and this might play into something that I know you had sent me, from a show sheet perspective of maybe a follow-up question. But the running back position last season was, by my calculations, the healthiest that we've seen the top end of the running back position be over the last 15 years or so. And so what happens then in those situations? Well, think about this. So if you look at top 24 running backs last year, they were the healthiest that we've seen. Okay, that means that good running backs are in a position to do well in fantasy, and that's why we saw all of these running back performances above the mean, or above what we typically see. And it really, really happened with RB2s. So like, the high-end running backs last year weren't that dramatically different from high-end running backs that we've seen historically. So I'm talking like top 5, top 6 running backs. It's when you got into like low-end RB1 into RB2 territory, RB2s, like, RB 12 to 18 to 20, RB2s were unbelievably good last season. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that, yes, they were talented and good, but also they didn't get hurt at all. And those are the positions that are a little bit more fragile if they get hurt, or they're a little bit more fragile in general, that another running back might be able to step in and do some more work and dig into their workload a little bit. But
just to give an example, I'm going to highlight this. I mean, J.K. Dobbins was the least healthy. He was running back 24, and he played 13 games.
Yeah.
Rico Dowdle, 16 games. And listen, the Cowboys held on to Rico Dowdle for 4 years, and I loved his talent, but the big thing about him is he could never stay healthy, and he played 16 games. Tony Pollard, 16 games. Najee, 17. Rashad White, 16. DeAndre Swift, 17. Montgomery and Mixon, and 14 games. Breece Hall was 16 at 16 games.
Yep.
Chuba Hubbard, 15. Bucky Irving, 17. Jonathan Taylor, 14. And then there was only one player in the top 12 who played less than 16 games, and that was Alvin Kamara, who will blow it up at, he doesn't need that many games to blow it up.
And the crazy thing, those names that you mentioned, because of the great health that these running backs saw, those names that you mentioned were the running backs that people were generally drafting at least in, the middle to early rounds, right? Yeah. So there wasn't that much variation between where we drafted these running backs to how they actually finished, where typically, look, when you see, so running back scoring was up in general. And I think a lot, like 90% of that, if not more, had to do with the health of the position. Because what happens is when there's unhealthy running backs, when they get hurt and what have you, which is inevitable in this violent game, when that happens, a backup running back is going to step in and probably not see quite the workload of what that, stud, number one running back would be seeing, but maybe get 80% of it or what have you. And then that guy can be viable, which is where, that strategy comes from, where people are going to be drafting, whatever you want to call that strategy.
Zero RB.
Yeah, zero
that's
RB
the one
or
with the big name.
Yeah. And so that's why that does matter, because of the fragility aspect of running back. And we know that they get hurt. And then we know that the backups are going to be way more predictable than backup wide receivers in that exact same situation. But last year that didn't happen. And so we got way better running back production than we've ever seen before. And so, or at least in recent memory, in recent history. So what I think is going to happen is there will likely be somewhat of an overcorrection by the market. And this is actually going to be the year where it's probably, I always go with more of that like hero RB, anchor running back kind of approach, where I'm just getting like a Bijan or something and just getting that RB1 spot locked in. And then I'll play more of the volatility game with my RB2 spot. I'll do that again this year, because I think that's the one strategy that, at least through my research, has been very, very consistent through the years, where you can win consistently kind of approaching the game that way. But I do think that we're going to see too inflated running back ADPs and costs for some of these guys. And not only that, but you have an influx of really good running back talent this year, where there's going to be messy backfields, which, look, I buy into messy backfields. I love what I've dubbed ambiguous backfields, because of the things that I just talked about, and that I'd rather bet on certain talents, to overcome a certain situation or an injury, happening, and that elevating the other running back. Chase Brown last year, great example. Or, you look at even Tennessee last year had an ambiguous backfield, and Tony Pollard, ended up being a winner out of that one. Sometimes it won't happen, but generally, or, sometimes it does. And those are the guys who actually do perform pretty well. But overall, I think that we're definitely going to see a running back landscape that's a little bit inflated based on what we saw the previous season. And, there are other strategies too, though, that, I think are consistent more year over year. I think that one's more reactive to what we saw last season, which, you should always look at what happened the previous season and kind of lean against that happening again, especially when it's somewhat of an outlier. But, one of the approaches that I think everyone should lean into and go with every year is what I call the pocket passer trap, where, we know that mobility at the quarterback position is incredibly important in fantasy. And the difference between, whenever I wrote the late round quarterback ebook in 2012 to now is that, back then you would get these like random one-off mobile and insane mobile quarterback seasons, like a Cam Newton's MVP season or what have you. And or even like RG3 as a rookie or what have you. You would get these like one-off seasons where the quarterback had great rushing numbers, but also had decent passing numbers in that year. But now we have these unicorn quarterbacks, man, where we get Lamar, Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, now Jaden Daniels, hopefully, where we're getting really elite rushing production along with really elite passing production. And those unicorns didn't exist nearly as much, back in the day, which is why, the late round quarterback strategy, because of those guys, is a lot more obsolete than it used to be. I mean, before, in 2015, there was literally no correlation between where a quarterback was drafted in the top 18 and how many fantasy points he actually scored. Like there was none. It just did. You could just throw a dart, and it was, obviously we had our favorites, but there was just no correlation between preseason expectation and postseason result. That is totally different, and it's been different since Lamar's MVP season back in 2019, where the market started to realize, oh, I need this mobile quarterback who can then also throw the ball really well. And so, from a predictability standpoint, not only are guys like Jalen Hurts, Lamar, Josh Allen, giving you an edge in points per game, but they're also giving you an edge in predictability, which is really key, right? And so there actually are very valuable assets in your fantasy draft. But what I always warn people against is what I call the pocket passer trap, where if you look at top 6 quarterbacks by ADP who are not mobile, and I defined, whether they were mobile or immobile, but who are not mobile, they perform worse than high-end QB2s who are mobile. So I'm talking about, QB 13 to QB 18. If you can find a guy, last year was Jaden Daniels, but if you can find a guy who is mobile in that range. Yeah, right. Yeah. So but when you can find those players who will give you some sort of edge on the ground, those are the guys you want to attack really, really heavily. And fortunately, you look at last year's draft class, there are a lot of dual threat quarterbacks from last year's draft class who are going to be sort of in that low end QB1, high end QB2, even mid range QB2 range. And to me, that makes sort of, I wouldn't call it the late round quarterback approach, because I do think that there's a lot of validity to drafting Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, and Lamar Jackson, especially in like shallower leagues and, leagues where quarterbacks are going to matter a little bit more. But, I do think it's going to bring back, the late round quarterback strategy a little bit more. Just do your best to generally avoid those pocket, last year's perfect example was CJ Stroud, where, people were understandably high on him with all the weapons they were adding, but passing numbers are just naturally volatile. Like you can even have, like, the thing that's crazy is that people can't comprehend that Jaden Daniels could hypothetically progress. Maybe Jaden Daniels isn't the best example, but CJ Stroud last year could have hypothetically progressed as a passer, but still seen not any difference in his passing numbers, because touchdowns are driving the game so much and touchdowns are just so volatile. And so that's where I think is like the staple. You got to still go with that approach of generally avoiding those pocket passer quarterbacks when you're spending a premium on them, because
yes,
the day you're going to be able to find a pocket passer late in your draft that can match that kind of production. And every once in a while you'll get, Joe Burrow last year, who obviously was still really valuable because of the way that team ended up performing general defensively and all the passing volume that he saw and all that. That's going to happen. This is just a generalization and just a general trend.
Yeah, and Burrow, I would probably describe, he might not be mobile from the standard of yardage gained in fantasy as a runner, but he's very mobile in the pocket and buys time and creates. But you can find, people are probably going to throw up when I say this, but like you could probably look at Brock Purdy and say he's discount Joe Burrow. And he's mobile like Burrow is, and he was QB6 2 years ago. And if he didn't lose half of his offensive skill players, he didn't lose Christian McCaffrey, didn't lose Brandon Ayuk. You're probably looking at a player who would have been top 12, and people are drafting him way outside of that right now. That's a guy you can get as an absolute discount rather than going for the premium pocket player.
Yeah, so a premium pocket player, historically, another approach that you can take with this, and I did the math on this, is if you look at like a QB2, like a mid-range QB2. If you get 2 mid-range QB2 pocket passers at the end of your draft, your probability of one of them hitting better is greater. The probability that they end up hitting is greater than the probability of that high-end QB1 pocket passer hitting.
Yeah.
So you can play the number game that way and just get 2 of them and just say, hey, maybe I'll luck into this year's Baker Mayfield or, whomever, right? And so, like, if you want to look at this year, like I saw, this is something that I'm going to probably yell about all offseason or all summer before drafts hit, but Jared Goff is right now like QB8 or something. Yeah. And to me, it's like, what is the difference between Jared Goff and literally like Dak Prescott? Or, I might even prefer Prescott over Goff, Right. And so it's one of those situations where like he is the clear cut, mid to high end QB1 right now. That is that quintessential pocket passer that just seems really, really overrated.
Yeah, for sure. No, I think that's and I think that's the fun part, is that people also, as a reminder, is because a lot of what I talk about is a mix of NFL and fantasy.
Yeah.
From an NFL perspective, Jared Goff is not overrated. From a fantasy perspective, he's absolutely overrated from this standpoint. So, and that's about learning how to play the value. So let's talk more about values. We've hit on quarterback pretty well. Who are some of the values at running back that you specifically like? And I know we've talked about some rookies, and Caleb Johnson answers are certainly okay here. In good faith, in a league recently, I drafted both Caleb Johnson and Quinshon Judkins just for this occasion. So there we go.
There you go.
All right.
A couple of running backs that pop for me. One of them is Kenneth Walker, who I've kind of had like a love-hate relationship with throughout his career. Like sure. I always think that he's sort of that splashier, easy to love player that I think a lot of people would just naturally gravitate towards. But when you look at him rush to rush, it's a little inconsistent, and it's not, he'll get stuffed pretty frequently. And but he's a home run hitter, and we love home run hitters from a fantasy perspective. I get all that. But last year was the first year where we finally saw him, deployed more. That was in a grub offense, obviously, but we saw him deployed more as a pass catcher. He basically doubled his best season target share last year. And then, you get Clint Kubiak coming in to Seattle and them at least addressing the offensive line a little bit. I'm intrigued by, I think they're going to be a lot more run heavy than they were last year, which can go either way for running backs, because obviously we want these like if you have Alvin Kamara or something, you honestly want a more pass heavy offense, because he's going to see a 17 to 20% target share, and targets are way more valuable than rush attempts are. But I think a player like Walker, you would be totally cool with them being a little bit more run heavy, and then you look at the pass catchers that they have there. When you project this stuff out, and I'm not saying that like Cooper Kupp plays a similar role to Kenneth Walker. That's not what I'm saying. But when you project it out, there's a 100% target share pie to get dispersed, right? And so when a team like the Rams, let's say, who never throw to their running back, when they have, a 11% running back target share for the entire season for that position, those targets, the other targets are going somewhere else, right? Yeah. And so I do think that the lack of sort of secure pass catching or pass catchers in that Seattle offense that we have right now, because we're going to see MVS likely run on the perimeter and get that, just be what people call, like whether it's a fake X or what have you, but he'll run out there and he'll just get deep. Yeah. He'll just be a sacrificial wide receiver for them and just kind of open things up for JSN and Cooper Kupp. But Cooper Kupp obviously up there in age and may not be the same wide receiver. I love JSN, but he can still get his, but some of these looks need to go somewhere. I still think Kenneth Walker can see, a 10, 11% target share in that offense. And then I'm really just intrigued by the scheme itself and that this tree finally getting to Seattle and it being a part of their offense and what that might be able to do for Walker, and creating those really splash plays, especially on the outside. So I'm excited about Walker this year.
Love it. So how about wide receiver then?
Yeah, I want to get your take on one more running back. Okay, can I ask you about running back?
Yeah, please.
Because we talked about this is a rookie, okay, and it's a guy. So it's RJ Harvey, and it's a player who, I wasn't like overwhelmingly favorable. Like I didn't love him to death pre-draft. I didn't hate him though. I thought he was just a pretty neutral prospect. But landing in Denver is just an unbelievable situation for him. The weird thing though is that when I scouted him, I watch all these guys, but then I also lean on my model a lot more than that. And then I talk to smart people like yourself. But from a prospecting perspective with RJ Harvey, I saw someone who had an okay but not elite pass catching profile. And with that, going to Denver and the entire upside case for a running back in Denver is generally they're going to see a lot of looks through the air. I mean, last year, Javonte Williams had 70 targets in that offense. If you look at my data, I always dated back to 2011. If you look at Sean Payton team since 2011, so this is 13 years worth of data because he didn't coach 1 year. And then obviously he had that transition then before he got to Denver. If you look at his 13 seasons, he's never ranked worse than 6th in running back target share, his teams. So they are going to target the running back quite a bit. And generally with a guy like Harvey, maybe long-term, I would say, don't be too bullish on RJ Harvey as a pass catcher long-term, because I don't know if his receiving profile is quite there. But when I look at the current backfield depth chart, I see Jaleel McLaughlin, who's a fine change of pace, but he's not necessarily someone who is going to command a 12, 13% target share in his offense. Audric Estime is not a pass catcher at all. I mean, he wasn't that at Notre Dame either. And so I'm sitting here and I'm like, look at this trend of how Sean Payton deploys his running backs and uses them as pass catchers. RJ Harvey's probably the best pass catcher in that backfield right now. I do think, did you have pass pro concerns with Harvey coming out? I know that some have, and maybe that would be sort of the downside case here. But to me, I mean, I'm going to lean into the ambiguity a little bit and say, not a little bit, probably a lot, and just say, hey, look, this is a team that's going to target their running backs a lot. Again, you look at the landscape of that team. There are guys that are solid, but maybe not elite, that we say, oh, they're definitely going to see aside from like a Sutton, they're definitely going to see a 20% plus target share in their offense. And so I'm going to lean into RJ Harvey, at least here in 2025.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's a great one to ask about, and we'll start with pass pro because that's one we can get out of the way. Yeah, he's not very good at it. It's
Yeah.
he can be late to diagnose blitzes. He's what I call a one and done player, which is basically he makes contact and then he's just a speed bump on the way to the quarterback at this point. Now he can improve some of that, but at the same time, part of it's his size, and you're going to probably use him mostly as kind of a chip and release type of blocker receiver anyway. He's going to leak out, or you're going to use him more as a detached receiver or a guy who's running against zones. And then at that point, as a route runner, I think he's pretty good, with zones right now, but it's going to be an adjustment to the NFL where they disguise things a little bit more. So there may be a little bit of an acclimation time there. As a pass catcher, he's good. Like he can make the back shoulder plays. He attacks away from his frame with good hand positions. He's good at identifying the defenders that are going to be hitting him and being able to protect the ball and come down with it. He has good judgment with how to attack the ball. The biggest thing with drops with him is that he's in such a hurry sometimes to get downfield that he has those Terrell Owens focus drops, which was basically, those are the easiest things to correct. So it's just more about patience there. As a runner, I liked him, but he's fascinating because most running backs who have experience with both schemes are usually, if they can run zone, then they definitely can make good decisions as a gap runner, because gap runs are like fill in the blank. It's just one hole, you hit it. With zone, it's multiple choice. He's a better zone runner than he is a gap runner, which is really odd most of the time. But he tries to bounce and cut things back on gap plays where you're like, you really shouldn't do that. And he gets away with it because of his quickness and speed. And I see him as kind of like what people thought Ito Smith might be for those who really loved Ito Smith. And then maybe he could become as good or better than Tariq Cohen. But when you look at the offense this year, I'm with you because I wasn't huge on Harvey because of the pass protection, the decision making, and the ball security were all a little bit had some issues to work out. So when you combine those things, he's going to get tripped up probably by one of those three things, if not two, early on. But I think he can eventually overcome it. But when you look at this backfield, you're right. Maybe the best receiver is Blake Watson, who was a late round guy who Sean Payton did compare favorably in terms of the things he could do, not how well he could do it, to Alvin Kamara. So we know that Sean Payton has a template. He got Pat Bryant, the wide receiver, who he already talked about, Michael Thomas. He talks about the stuff. So when I did my projections this weekend for Denver, I didn't look at last year. I looked at last year. I usually look at like the past 2 years worth of data to see what the pattern is, if there's a reason to. I looked at last year, and then I looked at the last healthy year Drew Brees had, and what that offense looked like with Michael Thomas healthy and with Alvin Kamara, and I used some of that as a model for how I would look at this play. And if Harvey plays well, and I'm projecting him to win the job and have the opportunity, I'm looking at 75 targets for him. 58 catches, 457 yards, 2 touchdowns. Okay, so that's not bad. As a runner, though, I think you're going to see it much more split up where it's him and Audric Estime. And so you're looking at just under 200 rushes for Harvey, maybe about 830 yards, and that's because I'm not anticipating this line to still be great. So I'm not looking at 4.5 or above in yards per attempt. I'm looking at more like 4.25, 4.3. So I'm looking at, I'd say about 1,200, 1,300 yards total is what he could do, which is good for a rookie. It's just not, sky high. And then there's the chance that the player that I think is most likely who has the most variable thing in that running back room in terms of value could be Blake Watson, just because it was very limited for him due to injury. But when he did get on the field, he had flashes with what he could do as a receiver, and he is a smart runner. So if Harvey screws up early, I could see Peyton, who's always had the philosophy of like, look, I can get all these guys late, and I can try them out and see. So, and he's the most likely to have three-headed backfields too.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's been the one thing that I've kind of disagreed with, not with you, but with the masses, that they take, the Sean Payton archetype running backs that he's had historically, and they take this backfield and they, copy paste on top of what he had. Well, RJ Harvey is more Pierre Thomas than he is Alvin Kamara.
Right.
Like that's where I think people will often get in trouble, is that, I've seen a lot of the like, oh, RJ Harvey is the new Alvin Kamara. Alvin Kamara was an unbelievably good pass catcher coming out of college. Like that,
yes.
Like his profile was incredible coming out. And so I think that's where folks might get into trouble a little bit. I see it though as I agree. Like I like the Blake Watson like deep sleeper take. Even like I think Tyler Bidet, or now I know it's Bidet. I always said Beatty back in the day, but
I'm glad to hear it's Bidet. I didn't know that. So
yeah, I didn't know until he had that like episode like on the sideline or something last year, and they were talking about him a lot. But even he was kind of in that same Ito Smith archetype too, coming out, and like I could I think of all coaches, we should not necessarily assume that the draft capital game is going to be so important to a guy like Sean Payton, who has an extreme ego. And we know that he will just play whatever he thinks is best, because he'll be able to find, because as much as a great success story, he doesn't want to be the person who wastes a second round pick on a running back, but he would love to be the guy who found an undrafted free agent who's a stud running back,
Yeah.
And so I do think that it can go in more ways than what folks are sort of buying into. But, to your projection, and my projections have RJ Harvey as like in the late teens as a running back, like RB 18, RB 19 or something like that.
Yeah.
I'll buy into that all day, because I do think that the upside is still there, especially in PPR formats.
No, I love it. And it's funny because you look at what were you saying about with Peyton? Peyton's fascinating on the perspective of of what he might do, but he didn't even love Alvin Kamara at first, because Alvin Kamara, like, the model was great for Kamara, but also when you look at the film, one of the things about him, like Harvey, was he tried too hard to outflank the defense, and he veered away from the scheme, and he wouldn't run between the tackles well, and it was maddening. Plus, he fumbled the ball a lot. And what I heard was that the story was that in his rookie camp, he tried to bounce some things outside, and Sean Payton just reamed Kamara. And what was funny is that there are a lot of young players who it would just kind of mess with them because they wouldn't know how to do it. But to his credit, he literally just he took that as gospel, and it showed that he was really good at making the adjustment, and showed how talented he was, because from then on, he was great between the tackles after that one correction, and he was good at holding on to the ball. He really did a good job with that. To me, he's like the Zen master of balance. Like, when it comes to watching him with contact balance, he's one of my favorite backs of this generation.
Yeah, I mean, look, and the other thing, Kamara was not a, RJ Harvey's a speed score guy. He had a lot of, he ran a good 40, he had a good size. At that, Kamara was actually not that. He wasn't. He's more agile than, and like you said, with his balance and his ability to break tackles. It's just he's just a different kind of back than RJ Harvey is, and so I just don't see the 1-to-1 at all.
Yeah, I agree. What about wide receiver then? Who's somebody that you see as a value?
Yeah, I got a couple for you.
Okay.
One of them is Devontae Adams. Actually, I think that I don't know if it's people just being afraid of the age cliff, which I get. He's 32, but he didn't slow down last year, especially down the stretch last year when he won fantasy titles for people. But I mentioned it before. The Rams have been bottom 3 in running back target share in each of the last 6 seasons. They don't use their running backs much at all in the passing game. They run a lot of 11 personnel, as we know. That's a staple of the McVay offense. That's a lot of wide receiver targets. And you look at this team, sure, you got Puka Nacua, who should be a top 10 wide receiver and ranked that way. But Devontae Adams and Nacua no one should be shocked if they combine for half of the team's targets if they're healthy this year, right? I have them projected for more than that right now. And so, with Adams, I think he can step in, be a low-end wide receiver 1, and then he has that contingent upside of if an injury happens in Nacua. Like, think about this. Puka Nacua, who plays stylistically like a bull in a china shop, right? Like he's just going to he'll throw his body around. And that will, I'm not a doctor, but that will naturally probably lead to a little bit more of at least a probability of getting injured, right?
Sure.
And so if Nacua gets hurt at any point in time, every week that he would be out, Davante Adams would be projected for like a 30% target share in that offense, projected for that kind of target share, right?
Yeah.
And if that's happening with Matthew Stafford in that offense that's generally a little bit above average in pass rate, Davante Adams is going to be a wide receiver 1 easily in that circumstance. He's often getting drafted as like in like the late teens at wide receiver when my projections have him at like wide receiver 10, wide receiver 11. So I really, really like Adams this year. The other guy, I'm going to go back. Like he burned me last year, but I'm going to go back to Jalen Waddle this year. I think if you just look at what happened holistically in Miami last season, and you look at, in particular, just look at Waddle, like yards per route run by year, 1.75, 2.59, 2.63, 1.53. Points per game, 15.4, 15.3, 14.2, 10, right? Like last year was a clear outlier for Waddle. And I know that people get frustrated because he's seemingly can't stay on the field. He's got that Deontay Johnson syndrome to him where it seems like every game, he's like missing some time because he tweaks an ankle or something like that. But I just think that last year with Miami scoring 2 offensive touchdowns per game was probably more of an outlier year for them. Just generally speaking, Tua obviously wasn't active all year. And I'm not saying that they're going to go back to where they were a couple seasons ago, but I do think that a lot of what they did last season seemed to be reactive to what was going on with Tua, as opposed to it being a staple of what that offense is. And I say that because Devon Achane had an absurd target share and Jonnu Smith had an absurd target share, really low ADOT type players. And I don't think that that's going to repeat year over year. It's almost going to be difficult for that to repeat to that degree year over year. So I think Waddle's talented. I think he's always been talented. So I'm just going to buy into that talent.
I agree. I mean, on both counts, because Davante Adams is still one of the best route runners in the league, and he's going with a veteran quarterback who actually understands how to anticipate throws and throw in a timing passing game. So they're going to be able to have a rapport with that with no problem. And Matthew Stafford also has that added element of see it, throw it, which is he still can burn a hole through you. And Adams is still very good at adjusting to the football. It's funny that you mentioned Puka Nakua's injury rates because, Brandon Angelo, my co-host on our Going Deep show, he is an athletic trainer and he works with pro athletes. And he said to me offline a little bit, and I'm not relaying anything that he wouldn't share, but he said to me offline, and I think he mentioned it once online, that he felt like Nakua was a little bit of an elevated injury risk, basically based on the way that he plays. And he doesn't say that all the time about people, but like he talked about Kirk Cousins this time last year and about how that Achilles injury and where he's going to have to plant his foot is going to really, really mess with his velocity. And and you're going to see a real lack of velocity from Kirk Cousins, and it's going to struggle with his game. And Atlanta protected him for most of the year with that, and you could see how poorly he played. A lot of it was because he couldn't throw downfield. He couldn't throw those intermediate out routes with low trajectory and really like zoom it in there the way that a quarterback needs to do at the boundary. So it's fascinating from that perspective, and he's a little worried about Rashee Rice from that standpoint too. But those are the 3 players he's talked about. But yeah, I like the idea with Adams mainly, and then when you look at what they did last year, I mean, it was you could see exactly what you're talking about statistically, how the Rams flow, and they run an outside zone game. So when you run outside zone, the running back is basically running defenders out of the play for there to be play action. Why are you going to throw it back to them in a herd of defenders? That's why I like a prospect like Damian Martinez, the Seattle late round draft pick, didn't get a lot of yardage as a receiver at Oregon State before he went to Miami because they ran toss and outside zone. He was the draw to open up the passing game. So it's the same thing in LA. And with Waddle, I've always been a Waddle fan. I agree with you on that front. And it seems like everybody's out on the Miami passing offense. And I'm thinking, Bob Harris and I were talking about this Monday on our show, and we were, and he was bringing up, like, it just seems like unless it's Devon Achane, everyone is all out on this offense, just summarily.
Just seems so reactive to a really bizarre season for them. A really you can't just assume that all those things are going to happen again.
No, and certainly, Waddle's one of those players that I feel like he's been held back a bit because he thrived so well from the slot early on, and then they used him as kind of a number 2. But I really think he could do the Tyreek Hill role if they needed him to do it. And he's that guy that I don't know if it'll ever happen for him, but I'd love to see a season where he gets to be himself. All right, so any values at tight end that you're, I know this is the least exciting position in fantasy football.
It is the least exciting. At least this year, like last year, and this is something I was writing up too within the draft, at least just whenever I'm ideating. But last year we had this jumbled up, just group of tight ends, in like round 4 to 6. And the idea was to throw a dart at some of them because one or two of them would probably emerge. And we got Trey McBride, and then we ended up getting Brock Bowers and George Kittle. And I think those 3 are just like the big 3 at tight end this year now, where Bowers is in his own tier because obviously it's, he did what he did as a rookie, which is just absurd. Yeah. But, now we're back in this world of you either get a tight end really early or you're just waiting forever. You're just waiting, or maybe not forever. You're just waiting for your favorite tight end to fall, I should say, right? And so that guy for me that I'm at least ahead of rankings wise right now is Evan Ingram.
Okay, sure.
And it's more so, am I going to go all in on the Joker role idea and notion? Not necessarily, but I do think that if you look at what Bo Nix brings to the table, really good short area throws, and we know that Evan Ingram that's his game. And then you look at just the target competition there. I mentioned it earlier. Sutton is fine. Like Sutton's good, but it's a lot of question marks at wideout and that pass catcher outside of him in terms of stability. Marvin Mims, sort of showed up down the stretch last year and did a lot more, which was good to see. But I don't think that Troy Franklin is necessarily an answer for them. Maybe Pat Bryant is that dude, and maybe he steps up and is able to do something for them. And look, I didn't think Devon Vele actually played that poorly out of the slot for them last year either. So but that's the point, is that they just have a lot of guys, right? Just do
11 to 12 yards per catch, and they're all splitting the pie.
Yeah, right. And so I'm thinking to myself, okay, well, we've seen Evan Ingram at least be relevant and be able to garner a decent target share. And in this kind of offense with this kind of quarterback, I'll buy into that. Especially where he's being, because he's usually like a low end tight end 1. It's like, okay, yeah, sure, I'll go after that.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I'll target a couple of late round rookies, and that I'll look at one of them. I think Colston Loveland and Mason Taylor have a shot to be. Yeah. I just think I love their skill sets. I like Loveland's fit in the offense. It'll be interesting to see what the pecking order will be there. I feel like Loveland is kind of a hedge for who we're going to talk about later, Luther Burden. So he's kind of a hedge for that in case Burden doesn't really get the role that I or we may anticipate. And then the guy in Dynasty who I just feel like is an absolute value, and everybody's just kind of like, it's like they were sky high on him, and then he went to the combine and they just said, forget you. And that's Harold Fannin Jr.
Yeah.
I love me some Harold Fannin Jr. right now because David Njoku's leaving next year. And I know that the Browns are a clown car at the quarterback room right now. I mean, it's awful what's going on. And the offensive line is also old and might likely leaving next year too. So there's a lot to be worked out. But with that said, let's say Kevin Stefanski survives this year. Say he and Andrew Berry are able to do well enough with Flacco or Pickett. I can't even say that.
Hey, look. Kenny Pickett gave me one of the greatest sporting moments of my life when he had the fake slide during the ACC championship. I was at that game, and I'm a Pitt alum, so Kenny Pickett talk is, I mean, you're talking about a Super Bowl winner here, Matt.
Yeah.
I mean,
See, you're right. You're absolutely.
Yes.
So him or Kenny Pickett, then we can. Well, I'll put a little strump into saying that name, but but yeah, I mean, either one, if they can generate a reasonably competitive season for at least half to 3/4 of the year, and maybe even be in the mix for a playoff spot for the final 5 games, when they head into the final 5 games, then you're going to see, I think maybe they'll have convinced Haslam that, yes, we should have gone back to this 2 tight end look. We should have done more with the run game, and the offense starts to take that direction. Then I think what you're going to see is Njoku's going to be gone. They're going to have a 2 tight end scheme. They're going to get a free agent or a rookie draft pick late who can block, and Fannon's going to be that guy. And Fannon does more than Njoku can. Njoku's a linear player who runs overs and seams and corner routes, and if you get him running straight line routes that break at an angle or across the field, he's a load to bring down, and he's fast enough to get separation. If you ask him to break back to the quarterback or run any harder angled breaks that require timing route type of finesse, that's where Fannon is really good. He's more Sam Laporta in that sense.
Yeah.
And then he can also run. And then if they completely abandon Stefanski's scheme and they get rid of him and go 3 wides, well, then Fannon fits better in that realm, actually. So I think he's one of those guys you can't lose with in Dynasty, even if he doesn't do anything for you in redraft this year.
I love that take, but you also look at their person. I always like just looking at personnel and the actions that these teams are taking, as opposed to just like, just thinking about hypotheticals. But if you just strictly look at their depth chart right now, they don't really have a slot. No. I think they have, is it Jamari Thrash right now?
Thrash and David Bell, their holdover David Bell. Yeah,
right.
That's it.
Right. And so Stefanski being, I mean, he came in, he was like the 12 personnel guy whenever he got to Cleveland. And so I think that's what they're probably thinking, is that they're probably going to run a lot more 12 than people are probably either projecting or at least looking year over year. Yeah. I would assume that Fannon pick was why they made that pick.
I would think so too. And that's the nice part about it, is that you probably can get them for free, essentially in redrafts, or make him a first-tier waiver wire option, and you're going to discover, wait a minute, oh, he's the Irv Smith we were waiting to have happen. And suddenly, and maybe that's the way it should be approached, is like he's what everybody hoped Irv Smith would be in that offense. And we'll see if that comes true. So, okay, let's get to Luther Burden. You know, we were both fans. We talked about it on your show, but why was your model high on him, and what do you think in terms of outlook this year? Is he Amon-Ra St. Brown in training? Is he something more, or is he something different?
Yeah, so the model liked him because I use a metric at wide receiver called breakout score, which takes age. It takes receiving yards per team pass attempt, which that alone is a pretty predictive metric. And it'll look at every season that a player has in terms of receiving yards per team pass attempt. It'll look at the age of that player during that season. And then it also adjusts. So it adjusts for age, but it also adjusts for strength of schedule. So, Burden playing where he played had a pretty good strength of schedule, especially his sophomore year. And that sophomore year was when he had that crazy production that he saw. And so the model said, okay, crazy good production as a sophomore, younger guy, played at the end against SEC teams. He looks good. And so his breakout score was 96, which was the best in this class. And that converted to a really good overall ZAP score. The ZAP model is what my model is. And so, the one thing that I'll say is that model doesn't give, no data is going to give all the context, right? I'm the first to admit that. And the model is one that doesn't give all of the context. And so if you look at, Burden's production and how it was accumulated, it was a little bit manufactured in terms of how he was deployed, a lot of screens, a lot of like slot fade type work and stuff that's a little bit easier for a guy to get that production. I always made the deployment comp of Wan'Dale Robinson, but he's not Wan'Dale Robinson in terms of what he can do, his size even. I mean, he's not Wan'Dale, but from a production and deployment perspective, it wasn't that dissimilar, right?
He's Brandon Ayuk playing in a Wan'Dale Robinson
Yeah,
role.
exactly. And so, for me, he was a volatile prospect analytically, even though, because the model looks at, to me, and my research with data and prospecting through data, peaks are a lot more important than valleys. And so the fact that he dropped, his junior year from a production standpoint wasn't that big of a deal at the end of the day, because he had that sophomore season that he had. I mean, we've seen players in the past. JSN had a worse final season, way worse final season, than he did, during his sophomore season and such. And so, like, I'm not one to get hung up on that the way that others might get hung up on that. And obviously, schematically and quarterback play and all these things played a factor into why, Burden. I think Burden also got frustrated because he was playing in the system that was just not very deep and fun to play in. And so Burden then, goes to Chicago. I see this as, and again, this is me thinking in terms of range of outcomes, right? Like, this is the way that I just generally view fantasy football. There's been a lot of reporting recently about how Chicago wanted to trade up with New England during the second round. And a lot of people are just automatically associating that with Travion Henderson. Whereas, why couldn't they be trading up with New England? Maybe they wanted Luther Burden, and New England needed a wide receiver, and Burden was the top wide receiver on the board consensus-wise, and they maybe were trying to leapfrog them to get Luther Burden. That's possible. We don't know. We don't know the answer to that. So I'm not going to sit here and give you these hypotheticals of like whether or not Ben Johnson wanted Luther Burden. What I can say is there's a slot opening in Chicago. I think that he'll immediately be the starting slot for them, with Adunze playing on and DJ Moore playing on the perimeter. Will he be Amon-Ra St. Brown? The answer to that for me would be, I don't think there's an opportunity for him to be Amon-Ra St. Brown right away. No. Part of the intrigue with RSP, and this is something that you and I kind of talked about, maybe even offline after the show, whenever we did late round perspectives. But, I do think that immediate opportunity matters beyond just the production that player is going to get. I think it does a lot for a player's confidence too, where if they're in a situation where they can be this focal point of an offense, which RSP obviously was down the stretch during his rookie year when he really started to blow up. But, that allow like having that opening allows that player to gain some confidence and establish himself more sort of in that role and as that player and as that go-to. Burden's not going to be awarded and that kind of opportunity in Chicago with Rome Odunze there and DJ Moore there. I think it's more so the outcome is kind of a headache year one where we're like, I mean, from a best ball perspective, it's probably a little bit easier to invest in because we don't have to predict and project which wide receiver is going to be the wide receiver that ends up emerging that given week based on matchup. And Ben Johnson's smart enough that he will dictate his offensive game plans by matchup. But yeah, I mean, like, I do think that there is something to say with our sample of Ben Johnson that, Burden is a player that of all of these guys profiles best out of the slot and profiles best as an Amon-Ra St. Brown duplicate, if you will, right? Do I think that that's going to come to fruition that way? Probably not. Do I think that Burden is very talented and that he could have crazy upside if they deal DJ Moore or if one of these guys gets hurt and all of a sudden the target share funnel kind of gets a little bit shortened? That's intriguing to me. So it's weird. I think in redraft you're probably not going to need to really invest. And I will invest in these ambiguous situations, but this one is just I'm to the point where I'm just like, just give me Caleb Johnson give me Caleb Williams this year. I was looking at Caleb Johnson on my note sheet because I'll be talking about him in a second. But give me Caleb Williams, this year to just capture all of that receiving production as opposed to trying to rely on a guy like Burden.
Yeah, because I mean, look, I got Caleb Williams as a 4,000-yard, 30 touchdown thrower right now projected from this offense with what we're seeing. I mean, and again, last year I talked to people about once Thomas Brown took over, I'm like, listen, he's going to give you close to top 5 production down the stretch just because they're going to triage this offense and they're going to reduce sacks. They're going to allow him to be able to throw the ball a little more accurately and get rid of the ball quickly. And in the second half of games, he's not going to be beaten to death, and he's going to actually be able to complete some of those USC throws that people went gaga over and thought this was the year it was going to happen. So, and looking at that, I mean, I'm probably a little bit more bullish on Burden, but not unbelievably so. I think Moore's going to play the flanker role. That's where he should be. No more split end bullshit that they did last year. And then you got Odunze as the split end, which is where he's going to be. And that means that he's going to play that Jameson Williams plus role. Can he get 100 targets? Yeah, I think Rome Odunze could get 100 targets. Could DJ Moore get 100 targets? Yeah, I think he's going to get that too. And guess what? I think Luther Burden's going to get them too. Because if you look at it, I think they're going to throw the ball probably over 550 times this year. It's going to be about 565. And I have Moore and Burden right now, and it's going to change as I start to really hone in on all this. It's May, everybody, so I'm just putting it out here, and then I'm refining it as I go. But I have Moore and Burden both at 120 targets, and at about the same amount of both catching between 60 to 64% of their passes. So I'm looking at Moore at 74 catches, Burden at 77. I have Moore at a slightly higher yards per catch average because he's going to run at greater depth, I think, the routes as the flanker, but it's going to be still varied. And then Burden's still going to get some downfield because of the ease of the slot fades and the seam routes and things like that. So he's at 12.1, which is pretty good for a receiver. They're both in that 900-yard range and 7 touchdowns. They're almost indistinguishable right now, if you ask me, in terms of how you get them. Just depends who's the bigger discount where you can get them. And then the big factor is even Colston Loveland I have like at 75 targets, which is pretty darn good. It's reduced from the Sam Laporta season. But I mean, we're looking at it from that perspective. I think that, and then if Burden gets used a little bit more as a runner, I mean, we could see Burden get 10 rushing touches. And if he does well with them, you might add on another 50 to 70 yards as a runner.
Right. Look, the dynasty community hated the landing spot because of Odunze. DJ Moore is locked up contract-wise still for a couple of years too. I mean, that from that perspective, I get it at a high level, but at the same time, Burden was a player that at least was not the easiest projection, the most seamless projection because of the way he was deployed, right?
Yeah.
And so when you find a spot like this where that he's not going to be asked to be the one, and that he can play out of the slot, and that he's going to have a good mind scheming things up, it's probably a better than not outcome for Burden at the end of the day, right? And especially if you start thinking longer term, DJ Moore is a really, he's a great wide receiver, but he's also not going to stay young forever, and he's also I still think he's a trade candidate, at least a candidate for that.
Yeah,
right?
And he complained last year.
Yes,
and they did not like what him and Cole Kmet were doing in the media.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I do think that there's at least these certain outs. And then the other thing that I always tell people about, and I talked about this with Jalen Waddle, talked about this with Devontae Adams, contingent upside. If one of those two Luther Burden has multiple outs to see more volume in that offense, right? Whereas you don't always see that with a lot of these guys. But I mean, I do think that Caleb Williams is the way to sort of capture all of this. I actually think even Rome Odunze is a good redraft target just because of the ambiguity and the upside there that exists. I'm going to throw darts at this offense just because I think it's going to be a good offense.
Yeah, and I love what you brought up about with the Patriots and the rumors there. I do remember that Bill Walsh back in the day when he picked Jerry Rice, he had 3 receivers that were contingent for him. And the one that I think he really liked the most was Eddie Brown, the former Michigan. I think he was the former Michigan guy who went to the Bengals, who had some Pro Bowl years, but it was Eddie Brown and Al Toon and Jerry Rice. Imagine if Al Toon and Eddie Brown went to San Francisco, and Jerry Rice was the guy who got his bell rung too much in New York, or wound up having a nice couple years for the Bengals, and that's it. So it's it's fascinating how this works. Okay, so what about rookies where you just really liked their landing spots? Obviously, we got to lead with your guy now.
Yeah.
He's your guy.
That's what I was looking at. I saw Caleb, and I was like, I just was so excited to talk about Caleb Johnson. But yeah, I mean, look, my comps are all analytical based, so they're not based on the type of scheme that they ran or anything like that in college. but it was really funny because the two top comps that got spit out in the Zap model were James Conner and Le'Veon Bell for Caleb Johnson. And of course, the black and gold, Iowa running back ends up going to the black and gold in Pittsburgh. You get a zone scheme, which is what people really, that's what ideally we needed with Caleb Johnson, just from a projectable a projection standpoint, and seeing him and envisioning him in the offense. Jalen Warren, I think, is still going to be involved here in 2025, and he can be a good change of pace for them. But this is a situation where I think if Caleb Johnson shows out, which I think he should be able to do in this scheme, if he shows out, Jalen Warren's a free agent next year, and the Steelers under Mike Tomlin have not ever been afraid until recent seasons to use true bell cow backs in their offense. And I think there's a scenario here where Caleb Johnson and look, the other thing that we always have to keep in mind is that coordinators change, coaching shifts, and Arthur Smith might not even be, Mike Tomlin might not even be coaching in Pittsburgh next year, just depending on how I think this is a really, really big season, for the Steelers in general, whether we agree or not. But, Arthur Smith might be gone. It's not like he's a can't miss coordinator. And so, but what I love is that, going back to what I said before, that immediate production, that immediate spot where Johnson can thrive, grow that confidence, perform really well, and be able to play in most schemes then as he grows and develops as a player, right? And so this is, to me, a perfect spot, perfect landing spot for him. I'm going to be throwing darts at him as well in redraft this year, even though Jalen Warren's still there, because I think there's a very good chance that we end up seeing Caleb Johnson just be the guy down the stretch for them, and then obviously that contingent upside of injury and stuff like that. So I really like Caleb Johnson in Pittsburgh. I'll give you three more. I was iffy on him as a prospect. I didn't really, analytically he did not look good. But Matthew Golden, I really like the landing spot in Green Bay a lot. Christian Watson has the knee injury that he's coming back from. So I think Golden is going to be able to play that field stretching role for Green Bay right away. And then you look at the long term. Romeo Doubs and Christian Watson are both on their rookie deal right now. This is their final year with them. Hypothetically, we'll see what happens. Jaden Reed, I love Jaden Reed, but they've typecasted him. He is a slot only player for them essentially, and so I don't think there's going to be necessarily that much development from there. And that's why they looked at Matthew Golden and they said, we're going to get a guy who we can throw in a Watson role immediately, where he can play and make big plays down the field. But he's more than that. He's like Christian Watson, actually, to me, analytically, this is pure analytics. Obviously draft capital reflected this, but Watson was a worse prospect to me than Golden is. And, obviously Watson hasn't really had the fairest shot because he keeps getting hurt, but I think Golden can do more and develop as the season goes on. And then, I mentioned all of the opportunity that he could see in 2026 and beyond. So I think it's a good spot for him overall. And then I'll give you two running backs. One of them that I'm just generally, this is the low hanging fruit one that I'm just generally intrigued by, is Jaden Blue going to Dallas.
Sure.
Just because, it's Miles Sanders, Javonte Williams, and Phil Maffa, who, is a very one-dimensional back, and Maffa. Javonte Williams, maybe he turns things around post-injury. Last year I just didn't think that he looked like he had it, at least what he had pre-injury. Miles Sanders is Miles Sanders. And so, Jaden Blue had a really good receiving profile analytically. Obviously has really good burst and acceleration, just given, and he's smaller though, which is the problem. But you're in a situation where there's not that strong of competition. They might be more willing to give a smaller back 100, 120 carries, in an upside situation, while also seeing, good receiving work out of the backfield, because they don't have a very reliable, like true, dual threat guy, and guy who can do a lot in space, I should say, as they do in Jaden Blue, in my opinion. So I think that we could hypothetically see like a Jahmyr Gibbsy role. Not saying that he's that, obviously, but I think that Jaden Blue could, in his career at some point, maybe get up to that 150 rush attempt mark. And the only way that would be the case is because he has an open backfield right now in Dallas. And then the last one I have to talk about is Jarquez Hunter, who goes to LA. I loved him. We talked about him on my show pre-draft. He was my favorite day 3 sleeper at running back. But he goes to LA, and obviously Kyron Williams is there. They draft Blake Corum last year, but all three of those guys have very similar size profiles. And we've seen McVay be the coach that clearly is willing to give a smaller running back, he's 200 to 205, but give a smaller running back a big workload. But also this tree, this coaching tree and McVay's style too, they're not one that rotates running backs by down and distance. They'll rotate running backs by drive. And I think that's what their thinking is in drafting Blake Corum last year. Obviously didn't work out probably to the exact way they wanted it to work out. But then they get Jarquez Hunter, who I think Hunter is a better prospect than Corum, or at least like in the vicinity of, with Corum. And the one thing that he brings to the table that Kyren Williams and Blake Corum don't as much is explosion. I mean, he has a lot more burst than those guys do, tested a lot better than them, had a better explosive run rate in college than both of them. Kyren obviously had the receiving profile, but this is an offense like we've established that's not throwing the ball to their running backs frequently enough. So I could see a scenario where short-term, sure, I think this is probably not going to be the most productive rookie season for Hunter. Kyren Williams is a free agent next year. And so what happens if they see something in Jarquez Hunter and they say, oh, we could just have a more explosive Kyren Williams in this offense next year? If they, if things do hit for Hunter, then all of a sudden he's at least in a tandem with Corum next year.
Yeah, that's a great trio, and I'll just say that Jarquez Hunter was saved because Mario Anderson Jr. decided to go play at Saskatchewan, but but no, Jarquez is a fine prospect, but it's funny because even Mario Anderson Jr. was similar type of size type of player. And I thought was an intriguing UDFA signing, but he decided let's split that room and get an opportunity to play right away in another league. But with that said, all those guys make sense. I mean, to me, Jaden Blue is in that kind of Austin Eckler archetype.
Yeah.
So you could see how that he could fulfill what you're projecting, long term with him. And then of course Caleb. I mean, Caleb certainly fits perfectly in what they want to do in Pittsburgh. And that's funny. Matthew Golden and Caleb are two guys I drafted on that team. Golden's a nice guy for working horizontal stretches. You can get vertical and horizontal with him in a way that maybe with Watson not quite as good from that perspective. So yeah, it's going to be fun for the Packers right away. I mean, like looking at the Packers right now, I mean, I just did projections on them this weekend and looking at Golden, I mean, I still think it's probably going to be, if they all stay on the team right now as it is, I mean, I think that it's going to be fascinating because even Savion Williams is going to be a fun look with this team. He's a guy that you can get. You can get him probably in the 5th round or 6th round of a lot of drafts.
Yeah, he's free right now.
Yeah. And what's funny is, Josh Jacobs is 27, and Savion Williams was a pretty darn good running back from what I saw and how I would project him. Yeah. He could move over there. And I like Chris Brooks. I think Marshawn Lloyd has upside. So there's some talent there, but in terms of like if I were to grade all of them based on what they did on college tape and what I thought they could do, Savion Williams would be the number 2 running back on that depth chart just based on that, And so, but I think he's a legit receiver prospect. So, this is going to be a fun receiving room, but it's going to be very cloudy. To me, Reed's going to lead the way, 800 yards probably around that range. You're going to get Dubs and Golden probably 2 and 3 in that range there. And then after that you might get Tucker Kraft, and now you're looking at like a mosh pit of like Savion, Dontavian, Mecole Hardman, Luke Musgrave, and you'll see if anything emerges out of that. So it's but long term, Golden I think is the pick. So who hurt your feelings when you saw that they got? What teams hurt your feelings based on who they picked?
Yeah. So look, you could maybe throw Luther Burden in here, just given the competition, but I think we established that it was kind of more neutral than necessarily bad. Yeah. I'll give you 2 other ones though. One of them, Emeka Egbuka. I don't necessarily I'm still drafting him because I'm ahead of the market with him because I think he's a solid prospect. The weird thing to me is that Tampa Bay just seems to be a team that does not care about archetype of their wide receivers at their draft. I mean, look at what they did with Jalen McMillan last year, who was profiled as a pretty pure slot and he played the perimeter throughout his rookie season. Then they go out and they get Egbuka, who generally people were projecting as more of a slot player. And you get Chris Godwin coming off the injury, who thrived obviously in the slot last year and has thrived in the slot throughout his career. And he's getting up there in age as well. And as these guys age, usually they do move inside more. And so I would imagine that Egbuka is going to play an outside role for Tampa Bay, similar to what Jalen McMillan did last year whenever they drafted him. And so to me, that's not necessarily ideal. And the thing, though, that I see with Egbuka is I think there's a very real chance that, we're staring at a situation next year where his dynasty value is through the roof because maybe they move on from Mike Evans. Maybe Chris Godwin doesn't show that he was able to come back from that injury. And then all of a sudden you're looking at Egbuka as arguably maybe the top guy in that offense, like maybe, right? I think that he can play inside out, for the record. Like I at least, like his yards per out run numbers on the outside were fine. What I saw of him on the outside, I comped him to Robert Woods, who Robert Woods could do both as well. But that's more of a median outcome too. And so I've had this really big discussion that kind of took over fantasy football internet a couple weeks ago, where I mentioned that I had traded I traded Roma Dunze in a league for the 108 in a super flex draft, because my worst case scenario, I was hoping to just get Judkins because I was running back needy, but my worst case scenario was Emeka Egbuka. And to me, Emeka Egbuka next year would be in a very similar situation hypothetically as Roma Dunze this year. Now, I would agree that Adunze is a better prospect and all that, but Adunze's team also just went out and drafted a first round and second round pass catcher, right? With Colson Loveland and Luther Burden. I really like Luther Burden. And so, my argument against that, though, is that Roma Dunze didn't give us and I understand that we can explain a lot of this away. I get all of that, right? But I also recognize that there's a gray area here where I know that these metrics and a lot of this stuff, whether it even is confidence or not, I know a lot of that poor production in year one is going to be predictive at wide receiver for future production. So I'm not high or low on Adunze. It was more so as a sort of a re-roll of sorts and getting a guy like Egbuka in a worst case scenario, because there's an out here where Egbuka might not be dominant from a fantasy perspective this season, but what if his peripherals and what if when he's on the field, he shows us something like very, very legit, like he's, and the dynasty market reacts to that still, then if they do lose Evans and Godwin, there's a much higher ceiling than where we're at with the Dunze right now. And so that was the logic behind all of that. So I'm saying that because I still see the upside longer term with Emeka Egbuka, but I do think that we're going to probably see some growing pains, maybe not growing pains, just general production struggles, here in 2025 with him, just because Mike Evans is there and Chris Godwin should hypothetically and hopefully be back. And then the other guy I'll throw out there is Tyler Warren. This is mostly a two-prong thing for me, where on one hand you have the quarterback play that we're all we don't know, right? We chances are it's going to be bad. When you're looking at just general probability, it's more than likely not going to be great. But then on top of that, I think all of the pass catchers in Indianapolis really do serve a purpose and play a good role and could play. The way they've compiled them is very logical in my mind, right?
They got a nice set of golf clubs, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Right. Exactly. But they just haven't had the guy to distribute the ball. And I'm a really big Josh Downs fan, and I do worry a little bit about him and Tyler Warren cannibalizing each other in a way, in a low volume passing offense, and a passing offense that might not have that much, or great accuracy, at least in 2025. And look, I know that that's a short-term view of this, but think about what happens then if it doesn't work out with Anthony Richardson this year, and we know Daniel Jones is likely not the answer. And so what happens then? Well, then they're going to have growing pains with a potential rookie quarterback or there's just this could go on for longer than just 2025. We can't assume that they would have an answer in 2026. Love Tyler Warren, the talent. I think there's a lot of intrigue there and he's interesting, but the landing spot is just really, really tough.
I want to touch on Egbuka. How do you say his name again?
Egbuka?
Egbuka, yeah. I want to make sure I'm saying that. Okay. Yeah. Emeka. Emeka Egbuka. Yeah. Okay. So with Egbuka, I would even add with your logic for that from a film perspective, my comp for him is that he's an aspiring Puka Nacua. and
Okay.
that he could play flanker or the slot, but he can be a flanker who can really do damage after the catch. He's a pretty physical runner
Yeah.
after the catch. So you could see how he'd fit in Tampa Bay right away because Evans is the X. You got
Yeah.
Godwin being the slot. That's
Yep.
where he's the best at for this team. And then Egbuka can be the flanker.
Yeah.
And I think Egbuka is a better flanker than McMillan would be.
Yes.
So
Yes.
yeah, that's an upgrade right there. So in this offense, you could see very, very much how he could end up being like a less, less volume heavy Nakua in that role, for Baker Mayfield. So I like it. I understand that. But I also understand why people would say, well, until Evans and Godwin leave, it's you got to wait a little bit. But
Yeah.
at the end of this game, when you say the trade off with Adunze is going to be a partially sacrificial X
Yeah.
because of the fact of all these underneath receivers who can run after the catch. Odunze is one of those guys that can do everything well, but he may not be quite as good as the top guys in every specific aspect of the game. So he ends up with a high score, but then you're like, okay, Moore and Burden are better runners than Odunze is, so he's not going to be playing underneath right now. As a route runner, he's better cast as that X than those other guys are.
Sure.
So maybe that's what he does better, but then that means, well, you're clearing out and these guys are getting stuff underneath. And unless he becomes just purely unstoppable as an X against top corners, and I think he's still probably a couple years away from becoming a Devontae Adams type, if at all.
Yeah. Well, the thing is that like people couldn't comprehend that I made just a fair trade. Like it was like, it's like you can't just like walk away, because I wrote up, it's a slow time of year in the NFL calendar, so I'm like, I'm gonna write up a couple of trades I recently made. So I wrote one up in my newsletter, and it was that 108 for Odunze, which the market would prefer Odunze, and clearly just based on what like Reddit's saying and stuff, yes, the market likes Odunze more than the 108, but it's what's really interesting to me with Odunze is I'm actually going to probably be aggressive with him in redraft just because it's not a high cost to pay in order to see if things do hit, right? But I also recognize we should recognize that the median outcome for Rome Odunze is a high-end wide receiver 4, low-end wide receiver 3 season in fantasy, like the median outcome, because that's where he's being ranked right now, right?
Yeah.
And my question to people would be, if that median outcome hits, what's going to happen to his dynasty value? Well, that's 2 years now where he's not giving you what you paid for. So there's a very real chance it's a falling knife situation, right?
Yeah.
And so that's why I kind of just played it safer. I ended up getting Judkins anyway because I moved up to 107 from 108. It was easier to move that piece, and so I got Judkins out of it. But like that to me, like, it's just so interesting how people react to some of this stuff because I like Odunze. Like, it has nothing to do with me liking or not liking Odunze. It's just that he's still being ranked as a top 18 wide receiver in Dynasty, and that's something that like I could go either way with, and I just went that way in this case.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot, this is a subject for another time, but it's about trades because again, most people fancy themselves negotiators. I live with a professional negotiator. I can tell you it's very different. And people who fancy themselves negotiators, they want to win at all costs.
Right.
That's not how it works. A good negotiation is a win-win most of the time, because if you have more win-wins, you have more opportunities to negotiate down the line, and you're creating partnerships, and you're giving you're creating what you both need. And that's how you win long term, because sometimes it doesn't work out in either direction. But so I mean, no, I agree with all that. That's great stuff.
It's not like trades for me, like good fair trades. You should sit there and be like, yeah, I could go either way with this, and like I could go either way with that. This is more of like for that team, it just made a little bit more sense. It wasn't like I'm taking the 108 90% of of the time. It's just. That to me is the way that you get deals done in the first place in fantasy. Yeah,
I mean, like, it's funny because I'll just say that I've experienced my wife's negotiation tactics once with a contract, and an outlet decided to offer me a contract and it was it's no one that I work with. Okay, I would never say this about anybody. I love who I work with over at Joe Bryan and Football Guys. They're
Yeah.
great, but I had an opportunity once, and they literally switched out the contract like on what we negotiated. And I was literally like, "Are you fucking kidding me?" And my wife's like, "No, this is normal. Like corporations, like what they'll do is they'll still be things added in there, and really our job as negotiators is to catch it. And you just casually, lightly say, yeah, this part in here, that didn't really make sense. I think that was something that." And they're, "Oh yeah, that was from something else. Sorry about that. But see, if I had not caught that, it would have been in there and it would have been very much to their advantage." And it's things are riddled like that. They put up these little just to make sure that everyone knows what they're doing and is on their toes. And if they're not, they still have that if they they can get that. And I go, "Wow, that's some cutthroat shit right there." And she's like, "Yeah, but like that's not how the basis of it isn't that kind of thing." So it's just funny how those things work. But one thing that's been a joy has been able to spend this past 90 minutes with you, and I appreciate that. Tell everybody as if they don't already know, and some of them may have crawled out from under their own mother's basement, if they're listening to my show, where they can find your work and where they can get the Late Round Draft Guide.
Yeah, draft guides for pre-order right now. I have the prospect guide as well. You can find all of that over on lateround.com. I've got my podcast. You will go to that site, see my ugly mug, and there will be a navigation for you to find everything you got to find.
That's awesome. Well, listen, it's been a pleasure, and make sure to follow JJ if you already aren't. And thanks again, folks. Have a good week.